everyone. I'm USTA National Coach Vishal Balini coming at you from the USTA Billie Jean King National Tennis Center, home of the US Open, and I'm here today to help you work on your serve. So the serve is a really, really important stroke in tennis because it helps us to start basically any point. It's a really good way to start the point on your terms, and hopefully, the more you work on it, help you build a deadly serve that will help you win the point very reliably. So step one is our grip. We have to start with the basics, and our grip is the continental grip. One of the ways to do this is a very technical way, which works for me personally. You look at your dominant hand, and for me, I'm a lefty. Look at your dominant hand and find your index finger and your thumb, find that fleshy part that's in between the two of them, and try to line that up as well as you can with that side bevel on your racket. So again, if you look at the bottom of your racket, the butt cap, you'll see that there's 8 bevels to it. It's an octagonal face. So try to find that bevel that most closely aligns with the side of your racket. It's big and it's pretty comfortable. So try to align it there and look down to just visually see that that makes sense. Another way to kind of approach this is to make sure that you're holding your racket like a hammer. So if I were to turn, right, I can almost imagine a wall here where I'm hammering a nail into to put up a painting or some other kind of piece of art. A third way to do it is to find the ground and make sure that that racket, the frame, is even on the ground when you tap it down. So if it's off to the side, like this one, a little bit askew, you know you don't have the right grip. So ensure you have the correct grip before we can move on. That's really important. And the nice thing about this grip is, even though it's a little bit uncomfortable when you're first learning it, it pays big dividends because it works really, really well for the serve, and it translates over to our volleys, translates over to our one-handed and two-handed backhand, and other strokes in tennis. So it's a good one to keep in the back pocket. Let's talk about our toss a little bit, because that's a really, really important part of our serve that's often very commonly misunderstood. So our toss is actually a really important part of the serve because it's the only way that we have the best chance to control where that ball is going to go. So if we set up something and it's a little bit off, a little bit askew, we're already putting ourselves at a disadvantage. So that's why it's worth taking the time to really make sure that toss is correct. On our toss, we want it to be very much like we're placing the ball in our ideal spot. So when our shoulder, elbow, and wrist is fully extended, that's where that toss should be, and we should have no issue reaching it. So if I have to adjust my racket or the path of my swing in any way, I probably want to let that toss drop and do it again. You have unlimited tries on that, and no one is going to penalize you if you want to redo your toss. Hallmarks of a good toss are a really good placement. So again, place that ball exactly where you want it to be, and make sure that it doesn't spin too much. So if that ball is spinning and you can't see the lettering on the ball, if there is any, you probably want to let that toss drop and do it again. Again, blank slate is always better to start with. So there are different schools of thought on whether you should hold the ball in your fingertips or in your palm. I'm here to tell you it's actually not that important. The most important thing is whatever will prevent that ball from spinning. So if you're holding it by the fingertips, when the ball comes out of your fingers, you want to make sure that it's not brushing against the fingertips and causing too much spin. Same thing with the palm. The same trap can happen, so just make sure that whatever method you choose, you aren't letting that ball spin too much. The thing with your toss is you want to make sure that the toss is not happening from your wrist or from your elbow. So you want the motion to be initiated, mainly by your entire body, but your shoulder will play a role here. You want to think of the rest of your arm as just coming along for the ride and not necessarily playing a leading role. So we want those shoulders turned to whatever respective side we need to be for whichever side of the court we're on, whether it's the deuce side or the ad side. But the most important thing is that we're ensuring that that toss is initiated from a source that's a little bit deeper than just our wrist or our elbow, which will prevent some jerky movements and help us to make sure that our toss is nice and consistent. So everyone's toss height, ideal toss height, will be a little bit different. So depending on your height, depending on the reach of your arm, and depending on the length of your racket, it's going to change. So ideally, the rule of thumb here is to position yourself accordingly on the baseline, make sure that that shoulder, elbow, and wrist are all fully extended, and we want to hit that ball towards the very top region of our racket, ideally within the first 5 strings. So we need to make sure that that toss is at least that high. In reality, you probably want to add a little bit of a buffer zone. So if that toss is, say, ideally, in your personal movement, 10 feet off the ground, you want to add at least 6 to 8 inches at a very, very base minimum to make sure that you have some flexibility for that ball to start dropping. Because again, we want to hit that ball as close to the top as possible, but the reality is, unless we have superhuman reach, we're probably going to let that ball drop just a tiny little bit before we hit. All right, let's move on to step 3, which is the trophy position. It's a really, really commonly seen position in tennis because it's often on top of tennis trophies. So if you've ever seen a tennis trophy, or you've seen a junior champion or any kind of person who's won any kind of an event, they may have a trophy with someone in this position. So let's take a look. We are going to have our knees slightly bent. It's a powerful position. We don't want them to be too far apart or too close together. Find a nice happy medium about shoulder width apart as a general guideline. Let's also make sure that that non-hitting hand is playing an active role. So we want it to be up because it's not only helping us to locate the ball, but it's also just finished tossing, right? So it's very important for us to make sure that that arm is up and in a helpful, powerful position for us to execute our serve. That racket is also playing a large role. So we want to have about a 90-degree angle, maybe a little bit less in the bend of our elbow here. We want to make sure that the tip of the racket is facing pretty much towards the ceiling, and we want to almost imagine the strings of our racket being right on top of our head, so much so that they're giving us a crown. So let's take a look at what that cohesive picture looks like. Going to have a nice knee bend, going to be reaching all the way up and ready to uncoil and hit a deadly serve. Let's move on to the contact point, because after that, we have to go from that trophy position to reaching all the way up. So there are many ways to do this, but I want you to imagine in your head a car accelerating, right? You may have driven to the tennis court. Imagine sitting in that car. It's a very common analogy, but you've just sat in that car. How fast are you going to pick up speed? You're probably not going to be able to go from 0 to 60 in half a second, right? But when we're hitting that ball, we need to make sure that that racket's moving at an appropriate pace, almost a certain amount of acceleration that we need in order to get a pretty good outcome on our serve. So as such, we need to start that racket here, and then all of the space between here and our contact point is room for us to accelerate. So we have some options. If we want to take our serve and make it pretty basic and have it start as a nice consistent point, we're going to start here and make sure that we're reaching all the way up. We've had a lot of time to accelerate. On a more advanced note, if you're willing to try something a little bit harder, start your racket here and then incorporate a dipping element. So if you're starting here and you dip that racket down, you're not only adding a lot of extra time for which you can accelerate, but you can also feel a bit more comfortable, and that shoulder is playing a more active role in hitting a powerful serve. The last aspect that follows naturally from those previous four is a follow through. So obviously I've just reached all the way up and I'm hitting the ball, but this isn't going to get me very far unless I add one more element. So I've hit that ball all the way up here. Now I have to follow through. So when I follow through, I want to reach all the way over the opposite side of my body. And it's really important for me to make sure I'm a little bit mindful of where that racket is going. Because again, that could be pretty painful when that racket is moving very quickly. You can hit your shin, and you're probably not going to be able to run and play a long rally after you've just injured yourself. So think about reaching all the way up, but then as I've done that, my non-dominant hand has dropped, and I've started to follow through across the opposite side of my body. Again, being mindful not to hit myself, which is more of a risk than you may think. Once that's happened, that entire picture can be repeated over and over again, to the point where we have that nice consistency, where we have that nice rhythm, where that shoulder is feeling nice, comfortable, warmed up. That's why, before even serving, it can be helpful to just take some shadow serves. I can do this and warm up and not have to worry about chasing that little yellow ball until I feel nice and comfortable with my swing. Let's make sure we're using the continental grip. That is essential, and it's something that we need to get right before we can think about the other steps. Because not only is that going to help us always focus on doing the right thing, but it's also going to help us just be more confident. If we can start off on a good foot, then the rest of the serve just falls into place. Let's also think about a good, consistent toss. Contrary to what you may think, you don't need to be tall or very muscular to have a powerful serve. If your toss is consistent, and that may not be the easiest thing in the world, but once you work on it, it's going to pay dividends, and it's going to help you to make sure that that serve is always something that you can rely on. For our trophy position, it's super, super, super important to make sure that we're always thinking about being in a powerful position. So not only does it look cool, right, but it's also a very athletic position. If you came over to me right now and you tried to push me over, you'd have a very hard time doing it. Next, contact point. When we're making contact with the ball, we always want to make sure that that arm is up, that we're focusing on hitting at a high point and not letting the ball drop too low. Even if you have a great toss, but you let the ball drop and you don't have a good contact point, that good toss has not served its entire intended purpose, which obviously is not ideal because you've worked so hard on having a good toss. Continuing in the same vein of contact, let's just briefly touch on racket acceleration. If that racket isn't moving fast enough, you could have the best setup, you could have the best toss, but if that racket is not moving fast enough, we are probably going to have a tough time keeping the ball in the court and staying consistent with what we're doing in terms of our toss and our overall serve. So keep that in mind. Lastly, let's think about following through. So you've done everything correctly, just commit to the last step. You've reached all the way up, you've done beautiful work. Let's think about collapsing our wrist at the very top and then following through. We have to follow through on the opposite side of our body. That will feel natural, and it should be something that becomes second nature once you've hit enough balls. There was a lot of information there, but if you want even more cool information, don't forget to subscribe to the USTA YouTube channel, where you can find more great videos like this, some more tips on improving your game, some match highlights from feature matches in years past, and other great content.